folks who are more senior in the field. So a big debt of gratitude to all these reviewers for for making this process work, and for, of course, your valuable comments and feedback through the process. So without much further ado, I want to introduce the five finalists and invite the first one, which is to present, who is Matthias Boen. Please come to the podium.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Also, thank you for being here, and also to the team division, also of the Academy, for the nomination. So I'm truly humbled also to be standing here and to present my PhD again, actually in a very short amount of time. But of course, I'll do my best to go through this. So who am I? I'm Matthias Boen. I did my PhD at the KU Leuven and Vlerk Business School in Belgium in sort of a dual position. And I'm currently a tenure tracker starting at the Utrecht University. I'm doing actually research really that's sort of focused on the management of ideas and how of ideation within organizations. And that's, of course, also what I'm going to talk to you about today. So taking a step back a couple of years ago, at the very start of my PhD, I set off with the quest to look at a certain topic, and I want to explain very briefly why I looked at the topic of idea contests. And that's mainly because these idea contests have been rising in popularity over the past 2 decades. This, of course, due to the rise of crowdsourcing, open innovation, but also these organizations trying to tap into crowds of people for generating ideas for new products, new projects, and innovations. And also what we are seeing more and more happening is that organizations are also tapping into the crowd of their own employee workforce, as they are a very knowledgeable source of information and knowledge on the firm's activities and strategies. And of course, this is even further facilitated by the widespread adoption of digital platforms. Now, in order to organize this idea generation, idea sourcing from employees, many organizations turn to idea contests. Now, what is an idea contest? This is actually basically a competitive process where ideas are being generated and submitted in response to usually a call for ideas, and where those ideas are then being elaborated, evaluated, and filtered out until only the most relevant or the most potential promising ideas remain. Now, there are a majority of very well-known idea contests out there. So this is also, I think, a very nice list. I've also worked with the Accenture Innovation Challenges on one of my papers. But essentially, while the idea contest is a protagonist of my thesis dissertation, in real, I would say the more central things that I'm looking at are 3 themes of ideation, which is idea generation, idea development, and idea selection. And so also each chapter or each paper of my PhD looks at one of these separate elements. And that's the main question that I want to solve is how can organizations try to organize these idea contests in a better way in order to improve these 3 activities. Now, in the first chapter, this is a very explorative study. I looked at the design of idea contests, which I actually did in using more of a QCA approach. It's a very exploratory study where we looked at the idea contest design elements and how they actually basically connect to each other. Now, for this, I have collected in a qualitative way or case study approach way. I've actually worked together with the YAML ID management software platform, and we have been mapping these idea contest designs from very different organizations since 2012. So that has been a long sort of data collection in a way, but it's a very nice data set, I think, also to work with. Now, what we did for each of these cases is map their idea generation level, but also how they were designed. Now, very interesting, in the YAML ID management platform, they customize the design of each idea contest for their clients, basically. So you see very different types of idea contests in there. Now, I'm not going to go in full detail, but this is basically how this ends up in a sort of table in a QCA analysis, where we look at different configurations of how these idea contests are being designed. And then we look at which of these idea contests, and then especially their design, lead to high levels of idea generation from their employees or low levels. So that's basically looking at and what drives this. And in QCA, of course, we don't also look at the combinations of how these design elements interconnect. What we basically find is that in this idea contest, you need to have actually a sort of a broad call for ideas. So very often we say, you need to be very specific on your problem articulation, but we also see that for simply generating many ideas, you really need also a sort of a broader call for this. This especially in combination with having people who give feedback to suggested ideas. So that's one of the central findings that we see. We see mainly also that in the low performing idea contest, this combination is always gone. So you really need these two together. Besides that, what you also very often need is to also broadcast or promote your idea contest internally to the employees so that they are also enticed to suggest ideas. So that's also something that, again, on the opposite end, we find that the idea contest that failed to generate many ideas did not have this. So this is actually study one, so very exploratory, and this brought us to the element of feedback. So the role of feedback and how this is actually being used in idea contest. And the second study focuses more on the development of ideas. Now for this, in this part, I looked at the boundary conditions under which constructive feedback could actually help employees to develop their ideas to a higher quality. And this we did actually at Accenture, looking at 3 of their innovation contests. And we looked there at different types of boundary conditions. For instance, we look at the nature of feedback, which we then did a interpretive content coding, distinguishing basically between constructive feedback and more of the cheering feedback. And we find that constructive feedback, of course, improves idea quality, which is quite straightforward. But we did not, of course, find this for motivational feedback. Now, I think more interestingly, we see also that if there's feedback overlap, sort of in a sort of text similarity, we see actually that this has a positive effect on idea development. And then further, we also look at the hierarchical rank of feedback providers versus the receiver. And we see that this also actually affects whether the ideas are becoming more developed or becoming of a higher quality. Now, this final part, this hierarchy, I found something very interesting because I'm also really focusing on this firm internal idea contest. And that's something that I took with me to my third study, which is a field experiment. Now, in this field experiment, the question what I asked there is whether idea selection decisions are actually influenced in light of endorsements given by people of a high hierarchy status in an organization. This is also a term that we call the hierarchical endorsements. Now, basically what the literature says is that we should expect that people listen more to endorsements of these high hierarchy people in an organization, because they might have a perception that they have a higher competence because they have reached that level, but also that they might in the future support your idea if you want to develop it further. Now, what we did here in a field experiment, in a very small nutshell, is that I organized a experiment at an educational organization where we had people brainstorming teams, and where they were then also asked to endorse ideas from other teams using basically stickers. And this was also the treatment and the control is actually that we had colors for these stickers. In the control group, everyone had just had the same color, while in our treatment group, there were different colors. And at the start of this session, we said that certain colors were linked to high hierarchy. So we really try to show that in a way that this has a different effect. And we find basically, based on 2,843 selection decisions, that these high hierarchy endorsed ideas, so simply the color of the sticker, actually had an effect on whether people would select an idea. Now, interestingly, we also find that this is actually mostly true for the people who are also actually themselves in a high hierarchy position. So that's actually something that we found quite surprising, because usually you would actually think that maybe it's the low hierarchy people who are more influential, but apparently that was actually not the case. So taking these things together, there are a number of course, also implications that I will want to address. First one is that in this thesis, we have now a new data set, which actually has an overview of multiple idea contest design, which is actually something that we have not seen yet in the literature. And we see basically there that these different idea contest design elements, they usually don't work by themselves, but only in combination. And so I think that's a quite interesting thing. And also this paper is, I think, very practically oriented. So it also has a very illustrative map for people who want to organize an idea contest. On the second hand, on idea development, my research actually underscores the notion that the development, especially of high quality ideas, requires time. So even already in these earliest stages of the innovation process, you need to give time if you want to end up at a higher level of idea development. But we do see that feedback is a very important thing here, but only under certain conditions. And then finally, in terms of idea selection, we also see very often that this idea quality can change quite considerably throughout this process. So we say that winning ideas are not always shining the brightest at the first. So we sort of caution against making a permanent idea selection too early on. Furthermore, we also show that hierarchy very strongly actually influences idea selection, which is also raises the question whether we should do something about this, or whether we should accept this, or maybe blind idea evaluations from the source of the employee. And finally, we also find that usually in literature, they say that there's sort of a straight downward influence of hierarchy, but we're actually finding some interesting results that this might not totally be the case. It might be actually a more of a complex story, which I think also warrants future research. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer at the end.
Thank you so much, Matthias. So we'll keep the questions for the end after all 5 presenters are done presenting, so that we make sure we don't run out of time.
If it's okay, I'm going to use this one because I'm still very jet lagged, so I feel like I need to move. If I don't move, we might have a problem. So.
You may not be visible on Zoom.
Can you see me on Zoom?
That's the camera right there. Okay. So our
Hopefully
next presenter is Aldona Kapachin-Skaite from London Business School, PhD from London Business School, now at Bocconi University.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I am very honored to be included. This is a great, great honor, really, and I'm very grateful to RAM for organizing the whole process. My name is Aldona Kapachin-Skaite. I'm now at Bocconi University. The dissertation is entitled Essays on Environmental Change and Innovation Strategy. I want to thank my institution, London Business School, for helping bring this dissertation to fruition. In particular, my advisor, Lacetera, that I was just told is around, so I might see him. My committee members, Colleen Cunningham, Kevan Vakili, and Olenka Kacperchik. And I want to mention that the first chapter is co-authored with Colleen and the second chapter is co-authored with Sendel. So the big motivating question for this dissertation is, to what extent do environmental factors, so factors that are external to the firm, affect innovation? And I tried to organize this dissertation in this kind of chronological to the innovation path way. So first looking at invention, then refinement, and then adoption or choice among several technologies as they evolve. The whole dissertation is based in the energy sector, spanning unconventional, conventional, oil and gas, as well as wind power industries. And I chose this industry or the sector because I think it's very important for our economies and for societal outcomes as well. So the first chapter is looking at trade secrets and innovation. We know from various surveys that trade secrets are a very important way to appropriate intellectual property, by far more important than several other forms such as patents, for instance, for product innovations and even more so for process innovations. However, for understandable reasons, we know relatively little about trade secrets because of the nature of the phenomenon. And so here we're trying to make some inroads into the topic. And we asked, to what extent does the appropriability environment affect the use of trade secrets? The empirical setting here is one that allows us to look inside the trade secrets that firms may actually have. So we're looking at the hydraulic fracturing in oil and gas, a regulated industry where firms have to disclose each and every chemical that they're using in this process, unless they claim trade secrecy, and we look at a subset of states where we claim those claims are more true. And we exploit a change in the legal environment. So there's law that comes into force in the US called Defend Trade Secrets Act in 2016. And what we do is basically exploit the heterogeneity among the states that existed before the DTSA. So I'll show you in a bit how it looks. The main finding is that as trade secret protection strengthens, firms use more trade secrets. They also invent in new areas, so new areas to the firm, because in the end, we still don't know what those secrets are. We just know that they're secret inventions. And we also find that there's recombination of secret ingredients purchased from third parties in what we allude to as perhaps markets for secret technology. So this is the main kind of graph that illustrates the paper, which basically splits the states that we focus on here into high treatment states and low treatment states. The high treatment states are the ones where prior to the passage of this law, the trade secret protection was relatively low. So we expect treatment there to be higher. And we indeed find that after this law comes into force, there's a very stark increase in trade secret use, invention in new areas, and again, recombination, especially in high treatment states. So the contribution we're trying to make with this paper is examining a ubiquitous but very much understudied form of intellectual property protection, trade secrets, and documenting their use as the approvability environment changes. In chapter 2, we're looking at coexisting technologies and innovations. So we know of this idea of S-curves, that technologies evolve along that curve. And we're wondering what happens when there's multiple technologies that coexist at the same time. And when incentives appear for them to improve and innovate, are they all able to adjust at the same rate? So the question we ask here is, to what extent does a negative supply side shock, so not a demand shock, supply side shock, affect the productivity of coexisting technologies? The empirical setting here is 2 different technologies. So looking at hydraulic fracturing on the one hand and conventional drilling on the other hand. So conventional is basically vertical drilling. You hit a reservoir and you then extract oil and gas. This one involves this horizontal drilling, which is relatively different. And what we do here is exploit this very steep decline in the price of oil in the end of 2014. So in the end of 2014, there was an OPEC meeting after which the price falls precipitously. It's very useful to know that this shock was very much a shock, that it was very much unexpected. The way we know this is looking at, well, talking first of all to a lot of people, and then looking at the EIA forecasts. And we see that the EIA is pretty good at forecasting the price of oil. So this is the actual price, and these are the forecasts until the moment just before the drop, just before the OPEC meeting. So we know that this is something that firms could not anticipate in advance. What we find is that this negative shock sets up incentives to innovate on the technology with a lower prior investment, which we theorize as kind of like younger, newer vintage. This is how it looks. So we see that these technologies more or less were, here we plot time, here productivity in terms of barrels of oil. They were somewhat parallel in the way that they were evolving over the years. But after the oil price tanked, we see that the unconventional technology became much more productive, and the conventional technology was somewhat confined in the things that it could do and didn't adjust as much. So the contribution here is documenting evidence of differential performance in coexisting technologies within the same industry, responding to the same incentive to innovate. The last chapter is building on this growing literature on resource redeployment. And what strikes me is that if we're taking resources from one setting and putting them somewhere else, presumably recombining them in novel ways, that may have implications for innovation. And so what I ask here is, to what extent does resource redeployment affect the technological frontier, the kind of investments that are taking place in the industry where these resources are redeployed, what I call the destination industry? Here I look at oil and gas, exploration and production, so upstream oil and gas, and wind energy industries. And again, I exploit this same oil price shock. It turns out there's quite a range of different non-scale-free assets that firms can transfer from one setting to another. One example, for instance, is this semi-submersible vessel, Saipem 7000, that looks like an oil rig, until you see that the same vessel is actually building wind turbines. And so when the oil price declines, firms are left with a bunch of idle assets. And what I find is that those idle assets in certain cases are being transferred and actually are enabling the types of technologies that are being installed in the wind power industry in this setting. What's important to mention is that this is not a demand side shock. This is not the fact that the oil and gas industry has disappeared, right? We know that the demand for hydrocarbons is very much growing and continues to grow. So what I find is that a negative industry shock, in this case, again, on the supply side, incentivizes redeployment and new technology investments in areas with lower deployment costs. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here I look again, this is time, and this is looking at the type of the wind technology. The main measure of wind turbine technology is the size of the wind turbine. So some of these turbines span several football fields, they're enormous. And installing that kind of technology somewhere out in the sea is extremely difficult and complex. And certain capabilities are required to be able to do this. And so what we see here is that while firms that had business units in oil and gas and those that were focused on the wind power industry were adopting more or less similar technologies over time, we see the stark difference as the oil price declines. My argument is because of this transfer of idle resources. So what we see is that firms with oil and gas experience are installing larger wind turbines, but in particular, the result is mostly driven by those that are close to existing oil and gas fields. And so the argument here is that they're transferring some of that co-located capability into the wind power industry. And so this third chapter investigates conditions under which resource redeployment results in new technology investment, pushing the technological frontier in the destination industry. And with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Aldo. Our third presenter and finalist is Ronnie Lee from the Wharton School. He got his PhD from the University of Michigan. Ronnie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. I'm Ronnie. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. At the Wharton School. I did my PhD at the University of Michigan. First, I want to thank the TIM division and also the organizers, RAM. I also want to give a huge thank to my advisor and my committee members, Felipe Csaszar, Justin Frey, Gautam Ahuja, Scott Page, and Jerry Davis. It's a great privilege to be here and share my dissertation with you. So in this study, in this dissertation, I explore how new ventures organize their structure to capture entrepreneurial opportunities. So what motivated my dissertation is this received wisdom that startups do not need organizational structure. And I was a true believer of this myself. I was once an entrepreneur. I thought startups, well, you need to be flexible. You don't need structure. Why do you need structure? It's big, corporate, and boring, as this entrepreneur states. And if you go back to the literature and think about it in the field of organizational design, it's kind of taken for granted that startups should be flat. So, for instance, Burton Stoker argued that startups should not have should be organic and flat to sort of streamline the decision-making process and flexibly adapt to the environment. Also, Blau, Mintzberg, and others have argued that startups are too small and undifferentiated, so they don't need layers of managers. And also, Julie Wolf and her colleagues suggested that startups would not even need structure nowadays. Why? Because there's more advanced information technology that can substitute the role of middle managers in coordinating information. And this phenomenon is commonly known as flattening. So given this prior literature, it seems kind of obvious that startups don't need structure. But in this dissertation, what I want to do is challenge this received wisdom. And I argue that an important constraint that the literature has neglected, but startups face severely, is the fact that they have no alternative coordination devices, such as formalized routines, procedures that can substitute and compensate for hierarchy. So Sutton and Rao in their book even states that even these small organizations cannot function without hierarchies. So in my dissertation, what I do is examine two questions. In the first chapter, I do a review, and the second chapter, I examine how organizational structure of startups affect the first product launch. in terms of creative and commercial success. In the third chapter, I examine how organizational structure plays a role in adapting to disruptive innovations in the context of entrepreneurial firms. And so let me dive into my second chapter. This was published in SMJ early this year. In this study, I examined two questions. First question is, are startups actually flat? And second question is, should startups be flat? And to address the first question, I analyzed the variation and trend in startups hierarchy. And in the second question, I distinguish between creative and commercial success and assess how these two performance measures can be differentially affected by the startup structure. And to address these questions, I use a large sample analysis. I conduct a large sample analysis of game development startups and supplement these analyses with anecdotal data and interviews with practitioners. So I don't want to bore you with the details of my theory. I'm just going to get straight to the point because it's already in the paper. So based on prior literature, we would assume that startups look pretty much the same with very few levels of hierarchy. But what in this study, what I find is that there's significant variation even among the same size startups, and this variation challenges the conventional wisdom that startups look pretty much the same with flat hierarchies. Second thing I find is that unlike what Julie Wolfe and her colleagues argued, that nowadays startups should be more flatter than in the past because of more advancement in information technology, I actually find that startups have been tolling over time at entry, primarily due to information technology that has made the underlying task more complicated and complex. So this second finding challenges the notion of flattening. And lastly, Bernstein, Stoker, and all prior classic literature on organizational design argue that startups should be flat in order to be flexible and adapt to their environment. What in this study I find is that yes, it could help improve your creative success if you're flat, but it can come at a cost, a significant cost in terms of commercial success, and it can hinder your survival. So that is the first study. And in the second study, I expand on this and look at when disruption occurs and how, and in the study, I asked two questions. First is, how does organizational structure of startups affect adaptation to disruptive innovation? And second, can the organizational structure compensate for incomplete managerial cognition? And again, I conduct a large sample analysis of mobile game development startups, and in the context of when free-to-play business model disrupted this industry. And what do I find is that first, not all structural and cognitive antecedents play a role in adapting to disruptive innovation. Second is that hierarchy, again, can promote, in contrast to what has been argued in the past, that hierarchy deters innovation. I find that hierarchy can promote the adoption and implementation of disruptive innovations, and it can actually compensate for managerial cognition, incomplete managerial cognition when adopting this and implementing disruptive innovations. And overall, my dissertation suggests that adding a few hierarchical levels of managers can be actually beneficial for startups in achieving better commercial success and adapting to disruptive innovations, albeit at the marginal cost of creative success. And in conclusion, this dissertation calls for more attention on the organizational structure of startups and hopefully advances our understanding of their survival and growth. That said, that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ronnie. And congratulations on getting that chapter published in SMG. So our next presenter is virtual, Charlie at the University of Texas at Austin, the best institution, my colleague, who has a PhD from the University of Michigan. If you're wondering whether I cut and pasted the committee from the previous slide, that's because they actually have the exact same committee. So I did not make a cut and paste error. Cha, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Let me try sharing my screen.
Okay. She's going to try sharing.
Can people see my slide?
Hold on. Give us a second.
Yeah.
Hey, Chav, you're having trouble sharing your screen or broadcasting your screen share rather. So what I'm going to do is I have your slides, the ones you sent me.
Yes.
So
that
I'm
works.
going to broadcast that on the screen here. And they're going to share my screen. And so you'll just have to tell me when to move ahead. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm on the title slide now.
I think the audience on Zoom can see my slides, and I also can see the slides that's projected there.
So the slides you see now, are they mice? Is that my PC?
I can only see the camera on you, but not the slides.
Okay,
for that.
so I'm gonna move the slide forward. Can you see this?
I don't think we can see the slides
Okay.
at all.
All right, hold on.
So I think the Zoom audience can see the slides I'm sharing right now, but not the slides in the venue. Yes, yeah, we can see it now.
All right, so I'm gonna drive the presentation. Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
So I
Okay.
get started. Yeah. So hi everyone. I'm Charlie from the best institution, UT Austin. It's a great honor to be part of this session today. I want to thank Ram and TIM for this amazing opportunity for us to showcase our dissertation. I also want to thank my amazing advisor, Felipe Csaszar. Yes, I share my advisor with Ronnie, and I share a good amount of, we have a good amount of overlap in our dissertation committee. So I want to thank my committee member, Justin Frake, Scott Page, Misha Topliski, and Brian Wu. So they have been supporting me since day one, and that support has been going on today. So I'm feeling very lucky. So I'll dive right in. First, let me give you everyone a broad overview of my dissertation. So my dissertation joins this long strand of literature and strategy that views innovation as an adaptive search process. So there has been a large body of research on what leads to effective search. People have a look at different types of search strategies. They have a look at how search can be influenced by various characteristics of the firms and the characteristics of the environment. However, one limitation in this large literature is that people tend to abstract away the heterogeneous goals and preferences involved in the innovation process. So in other words, while much attention has been paid to the informational aspects of innovation, we know much less about its political aspect. And as a result, politics has also been referred to as one of the forgotten pillars of the Carnegie School. So Ram, could you go to the next slide? Yes. So speaking to this gap, the overarching goal of my dissertation is to provide a better understanding of how politics can influence firms' adaptive search. So here I'm talking about politics in a very broad sense, meaning actions taken by the actors to influence decision makings towards their own goals. And I will be talking about both internal and external politics. So both those that arise from the heterogeneous preferences within organizations, as well as the heterogeneous preferences between organizations and their external stakeholders. For search, I will be focusing on various aspects of search, including different stages and different types of search. So as a mini preview, so my dissertation consists of 3 separate studies. I will also highlight how these separate studies connect to the joint common theme of my dissertation. So the first study will be mainly about the internal politics in the context of proposal evaluation. The second and the third study are more about external politics, one in the context of industry policy and the other in the context of production communities. The next slide, please. So like I said, the first study is about proposal evaluation, so which is a crucial stage during search where people look at some proposed ideas and decide whether it's worthwhile to accept the idea or not. So my research question is how proposal evaluation can be influenced by the interdependent structure within organization, which is a fundamental feature of organizations. Specifically, I compare proposals that target the central parts of the organization versus proposals that only target the peripheral parts, and see how the evaluation process can be different. In terms of method, I used the software development projects on GitHub as a fruit fly type of setting. Because it allows us to observe the proposal evaluation process in its entirety, as well as the interdependent structure, both of which are very hard to observe in traditional organizations. So for the interdependent structure, I'm using function calls in the source code to capture that. In terms of my main findings, so I find that compared to peripheral proposals, central proposals tend to be evaluated less effectively. And I explored 2 different mechanisms, one informational and one political. So central proposals not only create greater cognitive burden on evaluators, but also tend to have greater power implications, which tend to further bias the evaluation. One of the implications of this study that speak to the overarching theme of my dissertation is that usually within the literature of innovation, when we talk about interdependence, people talk about the technological implication of the interdependence. But in this paper, I hope to join the recent research by Daniel Albert to say that it's also important for us to pay attention to the political implication of interdependence inside organizations. So the next slide, please. So that was the first study. So the second study is a joint work with my advisor, Felipe Csaszar, where we look at industry policy. So we pay attention to industry policy because it's a very unique way of government intervention in that it allows government to impose very specific preferences on firm behavior. And our goal in this study is to understand how industry policy can affect firm innovation through a behavioral lens. So to do this, we developed a simulation model. It's an extension of the Enclave model, which is a type of model that models innovation as firms searching for high peaks, high locations on the rugged landscape. So in this paper, we look at how industry policy can change this search process by firms by reshaping the landscape where firms search. So we look at 2 different types of industrial policy. The first is incentives. So think about, for example, subsidies or tax breaks for certain green technology, for example. And we model incentives as raising part of the landscape, because when government subsidizes, they are effectively raising the payoffs for certain technology. And the other type of industry policy we look at is regulations. So these are strict rules about what firms can or cannot do. And we model regulations as restricting firm search to a sub area of the landscape. So we have a couple of several interesting findings, but today I mainly want to highlight the third finding. So we find that government accuracy, that is the extent to which the government knows where the global peak lies on the landscape, is not always a necessary condition for beneficial intervention. So when the government imposes preferences on firm practices, if the government only has a moderate understanding of the landscape. But if the government can reshuffle its policy from time to time, then it has the potential to improve firm innovation by allowing firms to dislodge from the local peaks where they're stuck at. So the next slide, please. In my third study, I turned to a different set of external stakeholders of firms, which is production communities. So think about Linux or the open source software development projects on GitHub. So nowadays, more and more firms are beginning to pay their own employees to participate in production communities, because these firms' products are becoming more and more reliant on the technologies, on the product developed by these communities. So in this paper, I look at these production communities and explore how firm-affiliated participants can differ in their search behavior from those pure hobbyists, given their different goals and resources. And specifically, I distinguish between two stages of search, the problem search stage and the solution search stage. So in the first stage, people first decide which problem they want to tackle. And in the second stage, given the problem, they begin to search for solutions. So I look at over 1 million contributions in open source software development projects. I capture problems by looking at the title of the contributions, and I capture solutions by looking at the actual changes made by the contributions. So the actual source codes submitted by those people. And I find that as firms become more engaged in the community, there tends to be a division of labor. So firm participants and hobbyists, given their different goals and resources, they tend to explore on different fronts in terms of problems or solutions. So firm participants tend to explore more on the solution front. So they are better at finding novel solutions for old problems, whereas hobbyists tend to explore more on the problem front. So they're better at exploring new novel problems with old solutions. So the next slide, please. So in my final slide, I want to tie all these three studies together and talk about how they speak to the common theme of my dissertation. So these three studies show that innovation can take place in a web of divergent preferences, both within and beyond firms. And the findings also show both the harms and benefits of heterogeneous preferences. So for example, the first study mainly show the harm side. So show how internal political struggle can lead to lower decision quality in the context of proposal evaluation. But at the same time, the other two studies also show how divergent preferences can benefit innovation. For example, in the industry policy paper, we show how externally imposed preferences can drive firms to deviate from their search routine and help them to dislodge from local peaks. And in the third study, I show how the divergent preferences of participants can cause them to explore on different fronts, and altogether that help them to achieve a balance of exploration and exploitation. So overall, by paying special attention to our divergent preferences, I'm hoping to use this dissertation to provide a more comprehensive and behaviorally more realistic understanding of firms' innovation process. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Cha. And our fifth and final presenter, but certainly not the least, Astrid Marinoni from Georgia Tech, and she received her PhD from the University of Toronto. Astrid, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, can we use this? Okay, perfect. Can you guys hear me? All right, so thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Ram, for organizing. My name is Astrid Marinoni. I'm an assistant professor at the Scheller College of Business at Georgia Tech, and I got my PhD from U of Toronto. So a big thank you to my committee, Joshua Gans, Alberto Galasso, and April Franco that made this dissertation happen. Okay, so the motivation underlying my dissertation is that while individual firms are usually the focus of the literature related to innovation and entrepreneurship. Lately, we're also witnesses how big social and economic phenomena are influencing the environment in which these entrepreneurs innovate, basically. And so you can think, for instance, about what happened with the pandemic, right? And how this had effects on innovators and entrepreneurs alike. You can also think about the increase in immigration flow and their consequences. And you can also think about the increase in income inequality, a problem that is present in most developed countries. So the aim of my dissertation is basically to connect these micro phenomena that are related to the determinants of innovation and, of course, the creation of new businesses to these big social dynamics that are so relevant nowadays. So I have 3 papers. The first one is going to look at the relationship between immigration and entrepreneurship. The second one sheds light on the connection between high growth entrepreneurship and the income distribution. And finally, the last one looks at the relationship between innovation and culture. So my first chapter is titled Immigration and Entrepreneurship, the Role of Enclaves, has been recently accepted in management science. And the motivation for this chapter is to basically provide a better understanding of the relationship between immigration and immigrant entrepreneurship. So the question is, does just having more immigration increase immigrant entrepreneurship? And the next question to ask, are there some characteristics of the environment that can moderate this? So, and past literature has found that, of course, the presence of other immigrants, that is the presence of enclave, is especially important for this. And so my research question is, what is the relationship between immigration and entrepreneurship, and how do enclaves moderate this relationship? I use a novel data set that encompasses the whole population of incorporations in Great Britain from 1995 to 2016. And I will exploit the European Union enlargement that happened in 2004. And I'm going to look at the effect of Polish immigration in Great Britain. And you might ask, why Polish immigration, why Great Britain? Well, turns out this was one of the biggest immigration wave ever experienced by the country. And this immigrant came predominantly from Poland. So, of course, there are a couple of identification problems here. First of all, the location of enclaves, of modern Polish enclaves, is endogenous. And so I tackle this problem by using historical post-World War II military settlements that will predict basically the position of modern Polish enclaves. And of course, we have the problem of the sorting of immigrants into areas, and I'm going to use a Bartik instrument to deal with this problem. So my results highlight how an increase in immigration increase immigrant entrepreneurship only non-enclave areas. And the mechanism underlying this is basically that block labor markets in non-enclave areas are basically pushing all these immigrants towards entrepreneurship. But this is mostly a subsistence type of entrepreneurship. And I have several other results that are basically backing up this hypothesis. For instance, turns out that firms outside enclaves have shorter survival and also worse financial performance. My second chapter is titled Who Gains from Creative Destruction? This is joined with John Vorhees from the US Census Bureau. And the motivation for this paper is basically the fact that we know that policymakers are constantly trying to spur and encourage entrepreneurship in the hope to recreate the next Silicon Valley. However, it's not very clear whether this is actually producing some social beneficial outcome for us, and actually who is gaining from this high quality, high growth entrepreneurship. So this is going to be basically a research question. What are the consequences of high growth entrepreneurship on the income distribution? We are going to look at different things here. So we're going to look at income inequality, average income, and also income mobility. The setting, it's going to be United States. We have a pretty long panel at the commuting zone level. And of course, we're going to leverage the great data that the US Census have. So we're going to use the universe of the IRS 1040 tax filers. We're also going to use the high growth entrepreneurship data by Gutzman and Stern to capture high growth entrepreneurship. Of course, here we have, again, some identification problems. So it might be that people are just sorting into various commuting zones. And so there might be reverse causality problems and endogeneity problems in general. We're going to instrument entrepreneurship using the mean roughness of the terrain at the commuting zone level that should proxy basically for future urban agglomeration. We have quite a few results. So we find that entrepreneurship worsens income inequality. And why is that? Well, turns out that benefits are actually going to the very top part of the income distribution. We also look at average income, and we find that actually entrepreneurship has a positive effect on the average income of everyone on the distribution. But you can see there how skewed this is. 81% of gains are actually going to the top 1%. We also look at who is actually gaining from this. So trying to create a profile by looking at the various schedules that these people file. We find that basically most of the gain are accrued to capitalists. These are people, these are entrepreneurs and investors that own multiple stakes in S and C corps. And finally, and I guess unfortunately, we don't find any evidence of, we don't find any effects of a relationship between high growth entrepreneurship and income mobility. My third chapter, it's titled How Does Scientific Progress Affect Cultural Change, a Digital Text Analysis. This is joint with Michela Giorcelli and Nicola Lacetera. Has just been published in the Journal of Economic Growth. The research question for this paper is that while we know that scientific breakthroughs and innovation in general are super important for firms and also economic growth in general, we don't know whether these innovations, these scientific breakthroughs also have an impact on the culture and how people perceive the world around them. So this is basically our research question. We look at one case study, basically, the theory of evolution of Charles Darwin, and of course, the publication of his famous book on the origin of species. And our data will be completely textual. So we leverage the Google Books data. For this period, we're talking about 45 billion words, and we look at also multiple languages. Also, we supplement this with the UK parliamentary debates and US Congress data. We're also going to look at whether this innovation have an impact on the political discourse. Our methods are going to be slightly different. So first of all, we're going to use a traditional diff and diff, using basically the frequency of Darwinian words versus the frequency of other control words that are actually mentioned quite frequently in Darwin's book, but are not Darwin specific per se. We also use a lot of natural language processing techniques, so mostly word embeddings. We evaluate semantic association of these words across time, so we're actually able to see if these words change in meaning. And also we look at sentiment changes. So we know how good and say how ethic a word is becoming over time. We have quite a few results. So not surprisingly, we find that a lot of Darwinian words increase the diffusion after the publication of the book. Interestingly, we find that numerous words change in meaning. For instance, selection becomes basically goes from being a word related to choice to something related to fitness. Also, numerous words that are related to the Darwin's work are basically becoming more ethic or better in general. And we find evidence that scientific breakthroughs are actually able to influence political debates when using the Congress data and UK parliamentary data. So I guess the takeaway from this paper is that, not only in innovation is impacting the diffusion of new scientific knowledge, but also it is able to change how people interpret the world around them and culture in general, which I guess has implication for firms and policymakers alike. And with that, I'm done. I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Astrid. We have a few minutes for comments and questions. We're almost at the top of the hour. If anybody has quick questions, comments. Andrew.
I'm wondering if you observe firms operating before the change in states that protected secrecy and then expanded to work in other states after that launching. And the reason I wonder is that could give you an estimate of the value of secrecy based on foregone projects for the end of 2006.
Yeah, so we have some high engagement because this industry starts mandating disclosure from 2015. So we don't want to get into questions of voluntary disclosure, which has all kinds of involved. So in fact, we have the same states that signed 2014 and 2021. But it's an interesting example.
Anybody online questions? Okay, excellent. A final round of applause for all our 5 finalists. Who will now be co-opted into the review process for next year. So for those of you PhD students, we will hopefully do this again the next year, and we look forward to your applications, and hope to have a great set of finalists next year as well. Thank you everybody for attending, for your questions. And there's many other good STEM sessions coming up. I think some of them in this room, so please do stay. Thank you. Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes, great.